So today is a very special day, a very special day. Today is the day that we get to gather together as a church family. We get to honor the calling and the life of three specific men. And today, what we get to do is something that's just different. It's a special, it's a unique, it's a God-given time within the life of this church and really the life of any church. And so as I began to think about the role and the characteristics of a deacon, especially how we as a church ask deacons and what we are asking from them, there are two specific characteristics that we specifically look at, or that we are asking for. On one side, we're asking for deacons to live and to exemplify service and to be a servant. But secondary to that, our church encourages and asks for the commitment of a deacon to also be a leader, a public leader, a leader that when people see you in the community and see you within our church, that you are a leader. And so when I began to think about both of those characteristics of a servant and a leader, I began to think, okay, so what text could we look at today? What example in Scripture could we walk through and think about and let convict and challenge your life, but also encourage and challenge the life of everybody else in this room? And when I began to ask that question, as most of you know, we have been walking through the Gospel of Mark. We've been looking at the life and the ministry of Jesus and his interaction with the disciples. And so as I was reading and thinking about where we could go in the text, I thought, what other example to look at would be any better than to look at the life and the ministry of Jesus? I mean, specifically, if we're wanting to look at the characteristic of service and a servant, and we're also wanting to look at the characteristic and the role of a leader, when I looked at the passages that are found in Mark 14, and then the passages that are also found in Mark 15, which are the last hours, the last final days of Jesus before he ultimately dies and gets buried and put into the tomb. When I looked at those and I thought about the life of Jesus, there is no better example for us. There is no better example for you three men as to what it would look like to be both a servant and a leader. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look through those remaining passages found in the Gospel of Mark, both in Mark chapter 14 and Mark chapter 15. And we're going to challenge and encourage and help set a precedent for what these three men are committing their lives to, both personally and collectively within this church. But also, if you're here today, I believe that everybody, in a sense, is a leader. You may be a leader within your family. You may be a leader within your school, on your athletic teams. You may be a leader in the classrooms. You may be a leader as a teacher. You may be a leader within your community. There are so many avenues that you also have in your life. So as we talk about a deacon here in this church, and as we ordain these three men to step into a God-given role within our church, I also encourage you, those of you who are here today, to think about your life as a life of service and your leadership and what God has gifted you and called you to. So would you turn in your Bibles to Mark and hold your place in chapters 14 and 15. And today we're going to talk about Jesus and his example of what it looks like to be both a servant and a leader. A servant is by definition, in the most basic sense, a person who serves the needs of people. If you had to boil down in its most basic sense what a servant is, a servant serves the needs of people. When we talk about a deacon, what's unique about this word is that it is the direct translation, it's the transliterated word for what a servant is. It's the same word used when we talk about servants. And so this is why when we talk about the role as a deacon in this church, one of the first and primary responsibilities is to be a servant. As most of you know, the first institution of deacons found in Scripture comes from Acts chapter 6. And as most of you understand and know the story of the local church and how it was thriving and how it was growing and how it was increasing in number, as the organization of the church got larger and larger, so did the problems. So did the needs within that organization. And it came to a point where the apostles were teaching and they were leading the local churches, and they were leading the local church both in teaching of the word and in prayer, that they got to a point where there were so many needs, so many physical needs, needs of widows and needs of the orphans, and needs of those who were hungry and needed food, those who had these physical, tangible needs who were there at the local church, that the apostles were being distracted. They weren't able to take care of their roles of teaching and prayer and leading the church in prayer, that they ultimately had to institute a group of people to serve as deacons, to serve and to meet the needs of people. And so today, when we talk about Jesus and we look at Mark chapter 14, there's a unique story found in verses 17 through 25 in Mark chapter 14. And this is the story of Jesus the night before. The night before he's going to ultimately be arrested and taken and put on trial. And this is the story of Jesus having a Last Supper with his disciples. And what's unique about this story is it highlights for us how Jesus was a man who served and who served the needs of those who he loved. Here in this story, if you want to read it with me, it says that in verse 17 that when evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. And while they were reclining at the table to eat, he said, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they were very saddened. And one of them said, "Surely not it's not I." "It is one of the 12, he said. "One who dips bread into the bowl with me, the Son of Man will go, just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." And while they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and then he gave it to the disciples. You see, Jesus was a leader. Jesus was a servant who always served the needs of his disciples. He always made sure throughout the story of all of the Gospels that they had food, that they had bread, that they had water, that they had their physical needs being met. Jesus never called his disciples to live in a way and to not have the things that they needed to have. And Jesus is the one sitting there at the table who's about to serve each of them their food, their bread, their wine, their thing to drink. And this same story comes from John chapter 13, where John gives us a little bit more detail. And he explains how on that night, Jesus got down on one knee, and he disrobes his clothing off of him, and he grabs a pail of water, and he gets down on his knees, and he washes each of the disciples' feet. You see, Jesus had a way about him of serving. Jesus had a way of meeting the needs of the people who were closest to him. But what's cool about this story is that Jesus not only meets their physical needs, Jesus is going to ultimately meet their spiritual needs. Because he says here, take this bread. This is my body that is given for you. And then he says, take this wine. And this is my blood that is poured out for you. Jesus serves those people, the people that he knew and he loved and he cared the most about. And he met their needs both physically and spiritually. They didn't even know what it was that he was doing for them that night. And they didn't even know what the next few days were going to entail for them as the disciples. But Jesus did. And he knew what it looked like to be a servant. And so my challenge for you, for the three of you men who are here today, who are stepping into this role to be a deacon, is how are you going to serve the needs of our people? And when it comes to serving the needs of our people within our church and within our community, the only way you can honestly and effectively serve the needs of our people is to get to know our people. And this is the hard part when it comes to serving the needs of our people within our church and in our community, is that there are small numbers of people that we associate with. The people that we're friends with, the people that we grew up with, the people we're raised with, the people who look like us and think like us and work in the similar jobs as us. But what's difficult about the role of a deacon is that a deacon is called to serve all of the church. So how are you going to serve the needs of the older single ladies whose husbands may not be alive anymore within our church? Well, you're going to have to get to know those ladies. How are you going to serve the older men within our church who you don't cross paths with? Well, the only way you can do that is to go and to intentionally spend time with those men. How are you going to serve the younger men and women who work in different jobs, who either work in town or out of town, but have completely different lives than you do? You're going to have to go and spend time with the younger men and the younger married couples within our church. How are you going to learn to serve the needs of the youth and the children and the younger people that we do have currently coming to our church, when they are nothing like many of the people in your generation? Well, the only way you can do that is you have to intentionally spend time with them. One of the worst things that could ever happen in this church is that we have, on one hand, a group of older men who serve as deacons in our church, and then on the other hand, you have a younger pastor who pastors and serves at this church. And one of the easy things to happen that we don't want to happen is that the older men serve the needs of the older men and older adults in our church, and then the young pastor grows and serves the needs of the younger families in the church. But that's not good for the church. You see, Jesus made very clear that those whom he loved, his disciples, he had that inner circle, the Peter, the James, and the John that he loved, and he spent special time with them. But Jesus knew how to serve the needs of all of his disciples in a way that he spent time getting to know both their physical and their emotional and their spiritual needs. And you see, as a servant, as a deacon, we are calling you. We are encouraging you. We are asking you to step into a role as a servant and to serve the needs collectively of all of our church. And that is hard, because the only way you're going to know what those needs are to spend time collectively with all of the different people that make up our church family. You see, not only are we going to talk about this role as a servant, but we're also going to talk about the role of a leader. Historically, within this church, the deacon committee and the deacon board has served as a role of leadership in conjunction as a team with the pastor of the time. And so as a pastor, I work hand in hand collectively with our group of men who serve as deacons, and we do our best to try to lead the church. And so we're asking you to step into that role on a team as a leader. And today, as we talk about what a leader does, and we look at the examples of leadership that Jesus gives us out of Mark chapter 14 and 15, there are two unique characteristics that Jesus gives us. In the world today, there are all kinds of ideas. There are all kinds of philosophies. There are all kinds of books and characteristics and attributes written about leadership. And so the two today that I may give you, or that I may open your eyes to, may not be two of the most famous ones. But there are two that are specifically given to us from Jesus and exemplified by the life of Jesus. And the first one comes out of Mark chapter 14, and it's going to be found in verses 60 through 62. So if you'll turn over there, and the first characteristic that Jesus gives us about leadership is that leaders lead by doing more than what they say. A leader, an effective, a beneficial leader, is a person who does more than what he says. Unfortunately, we live in a world today that has a couple other ideas when it talks about doing and saying. Most of the time, people say, let me get this right. We tend to say a lot and then do very little. We also may tend to do or say very little and do even less. But here in this chapter, here in these verses, we're going to see how Jesus leads from a platform where he does far more than he actually says. So look at the story that's found in Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 60. And this is the portion of the scripture that Jesus has been taken away. He's been arrested, and now he's standing before Caiaphas, and Caiaphas is beginning to question Jesus. And you can back up to verse 57. It says, "Then some stood up, and they gave false testimony about Jesus. We heard him say that I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man. Yet even their testimonies didn't agree. So then the high priest, he stood before them, and he asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to give an answer? What is the testimony of these men that are bringing against you?' But Jesus, he remained silent, and he gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus. 'And you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One, coming in the clouds of heaven.'" You see, what's unique about this story is that Jesus, standing in front of hundreds and potentially thousands of people who were bearing false witness against him, who were telling all of these ideas and these stories and these lies about him so that ultimately they could lead him away after being arrested so that they could kill him. And Jesus, the man who would, if there was anybody who could and would have a defense for himself, who could stand publicly and do things that none of us in this room could honestly do, Jesus, he stood quiet. He was a man who did far more than what he would ever say. You see, Jesus was standing there that day making it very clear that he was not going to be another religious leader like all of the religious leaders who were there that day or who had come before him, who would make a spectacle of their words. who would make these big philosophic approaches, who would say all of these words to try to get people to do all these different things. You see, that wasn't the ministry in the life of Jesus. Jesus didn't want to make a spectacle of his words, but instead he chose to lead by making a statement with his life. And as a leader, for you three men, and for each of you who are here today, in whatever roles that you're leading in your life and in your family and in your jobs and in your schools, it's easy to say a lot of words and to talk about a lot of things, and then unfortunately to back it up with very little actions. But Jesus, he exemplifies for us what it looks like to lead with our actions and to not lead so much with our words. And if anybody had the power, and if anybody had the authority, at the snapping of his fingers, Jesus could have brought down armies of angels to take over that scenario. But instead, Jesus, in front of all of the false testimonies, he remained silent. And he stood there, and he made a statement with his life and with his actions. And so, men, I challenge you today to be men who lead, who don't just lead by saying things, who don't just lead by talking about things, who don't just lead with words that they want to speak and talk about and bring up, but that when we meet and when we desire to do things and when we desire as a team to lead, that we would lead far more with our actions than with our words. Not only does Jesus give us the characteristic that a leader leads by doing more than he says, but Jesus also gives us the example that a leader leads people through personal sacrifice. Jesus is the ultimate example in his life of how to lead and how to lead people that you love through personal sacrifice. You see, in this story, in Mark chapter 14 and 15, in the last hours and in the final couple of days of the life of Jesus, there are a few things that he personally sacrificed. Two specifically. The first one comes in sacrificing the approval of others. Turn to Mark chapter 14 and look at the story found in verses 43 through 51. And this is a tough aspect of leadership. This is a tough story because verses 43 through 51 in Mark 14 is the difficult story of Jesus being betrayed. And when we look at Jesus being betrayed, he's not betrayed by just the religious leaders. He's not betrayed by the people on the outside. He's betrayed by one that he loved and that he took care of and that he provided for and that he served. He is betrayed by one of his 12 disciples. He is betrayed by the disciple known as Judas. And what's so hard about this is that the call to leadership is a call that helps us, or that we have to understand is often a call to sometimes being betrayed. Because those that you love and that you lead, and specifically if you're going to love and lead and serve those within the church, if you're going to serve men and women and boys and girls who are all flawed by sin, then you're going to have to serve and lead in a way where you sacrifice the acceptance of others. Because you are at some point going to find yourself being betrayed by other people. This is the difficult aspect of leadership that is so hard to come to grips with. Because we lead and we serve people who are flawed, who make mistakes, who have sin in their life. And often those people will betray you. This is why the call for you three men to serve as deacons, it must be first and foremost a call that you are accepting from the Lord. Because if you are here today and you're accepting a call and a commitment to serve and to lead in this church because a group of people persuaded you to do it, at some point, in some time in the future, you could find yourself betrayed by those exact people. But if you're here today and you're answering a call and an encouragement and making a commitment to the Lord to serve Him as a deacon and to lead under His leadership, then that is a call that won't be betrayed. Because as a leader, you will find yourself, if you put your hope and your trust and your desire and your passion in other people, all people at some point can and will let you down. But the one who won't ever let you down, His name is Jesus. He is the one, He is the author and the finisher of your faith. He is the one that strengthens you and who empowers you. And so today, my encouragement for you is to come to a clear realization that it's not just us as a church who are calling you and encouraging you and wanting to ordain you three as deacons. But first and foremost, it has to be a call on your life that is given to you from the Lord. The final aspect of a leader of people through personal sacrifice, comes in Mark 14, and it comes out of verse 36. This is the portion of the story where Jesus, the night before, it was all alone. And Jesus, being all alone, finds himself in the garden. And this is the very emotional prayer that Jesus prays between himself and the Father. And there's so much anxiety. There are so many things that are going on inside of him that his body is reacting in a very difficult way. And there's this portion of the prayer where he says, Father, I really, really, really don't want to do this. This is going to be hard. This is not going to be fun. This is not going to be easy. There are so many people who are going to be against me. And Father, it feels like you're going to be the only one for me. And I really don't want to go through what's about to happen in the next couple of days. And as a leader in your life and in your families, and as a deacon, as a leader and a servant within this church, there are going to be times when you feel that way. There are going to be times where you may feel like you don't want to go forward, that you don't want to continue on in that pathway, where there seems like there's more people who are against you than who are for you, when your body begins to not like the position that you're in. But a leader who leads people through personal sacrifice is a person who sacrifices their own personal agendas. Far too often when we get into roles of leadership, whether in our lives or within the church or in jobs, we often bring our own thoughts, our own desires, our own opinions, our own hopes and dreams for the future. We often bring those individually to wherever we're at, and we place those over the desires of the Lord for that institution. And so one of the things that we are asking for you today as a deacon and as a servant and as a leader within this church is to sacrifice your personal agenda, the thing that you want the most, the way that you want it to happen the most often. We're asking you to lay that on the altar. Just like Jesus did in Mark 14:36. After he brought everything personally to the Lord, he came to the realization and he said, Father, not my will, but your will be done. And that is so hard to pray. That is so hard to exemplify and to live out, because there are so many things that we as individuals want. There are so many things that we want to see happen in the ways that we want to see them happen. And there is no doubt that Jesus had those same personal agendas and those same thoughts and those same feelings. But Jesus shows us what a true leader looks like. A true leader serves the needs of his people, ultimately by getting to know his people. And a leader does far more than he ever says. Is a man who leads with actions and not with words. And then finally, Jesus shows us that a leader, an exemplified leader, a good leader, leads through personal sacrifice. Sacrificing the approval of others, and ultimately sacrificing our own agendas, so that it's not our will being done, but that it's the desires and the will of the Father for your life and ultimately for the life of our church.